All right, welcome to the Charting Life podcast, where we dive into life's uncharted and often overlooked areas of life through meaningful conversations, and always with a great, healthy dose of laughter. If I can talk out loud, I can already hear myself saying, getting tripped up with my words. So this will be fun today. This is an episode I've been excited about for several weeks. Today, I'm going to talk with Dustin Wright from Raising the Wild Ones podcast. He'll be joining us to talk about some of the weird, overlooked parts of the Bible, paranormal stories, and/or whatever else excites us, or wherever the conversation takes us. Dustin is briefly a bit of introduction. Dustin's a husband and father of three in Central Texas on a small farm, like you said. He was a youth minister for 8 years, and so God called you to a camp ministry where he's currently serving. He's working on your master's of theology with a focus on biblical writings and primarily with the Greek. And your podcast, Raising the Wild Ones, tends to talk about the weirder sides of the Bible, giants, demons, supernatural, along with a lot of hunting, fishing, redneck theology. I love that sort of stuff. And there's a great quote that you mentioned in there is that as far as the Bible is, if it's weird, it probably matters.
Oh
And it
yeah.
looks like you can also geek out about a whole bunch of other stuff, including Star Wars and video games. So, is there anything that I missed, or anything else that you want to add to that? Kind of give people just a real quick idea of who you are, what you do.
Oh man, that's perfect. That's pretty much kind of what it is. I mean, it kind of made me laugh because like 30 minutes ago I was messing with the chickens outside. So that's kind of what it is. You mess with chickens 1 minute and like 20 minutes later you're recording a podcast, right?
Man, that's awesome. I like that quite a bit. My wife has been very much wanting chickens, and I'm not against the idea. I'm just trying to brace myself because it's one of the. It's not quite like having a cat or a dog. Once you start with chickens, it's an everyday of your life kind of thing, and you just got to kind of keep going for it. We got some people, good friends of ours, families in church. They got their homestead they're working on, and we were out over there today getting some. Talking to them, getting some plants and stuff, get my wife's garden set up, and I forget probably got a few dozen chickens, and they got some for meat, some for eggs, and it's just very interesting watching the whole thing. But it takes a lot out of you.
The only thing I'll say with chickens, okay, and then we can stop talking about chickens, or if we want to, I don't care. It doesn't bother me.
Yeah.
Is we started saying we were only going to get like 6 chickens, and then my wife went to Tractor Supply and she bought 12 chickens. And then we had some friends who were like, "Hey, we're hatching some chicks. Do you want these chickens?" And we're like, "Sure, yeah, why not?" And so now we have 18. So I'm just saying we started with 6 and now there's 18 chickens. So
Right.
it's a real thing with chickens. You say like only 4, and then you're gonna have like 35. So
Yeah.
this is what it
Yeah.
is.
I wish maybe one of those days we'll be able to kind of stretch out and move to a place where we have a little bit more land and doing that. Our general area of the city only limits to 6 chickens, so we'll have to
Eh.
we'll see how that goes. Right. What's one or two more as we go along? I guess that's unofficially. Can't technically endorse breaking the law, but if you get an extra bird out of it.
If
So yeah, go ahead.
also
Go
you
ahead.
know what they can't see if you got a privacy fence. You know.
All right. Oh man, that sounds fun. Let's get into a little bit of a biographical, just make sure we kind of understand, get to know you a little bit better. What was your family life like growing up? Family, siblings, what was that about?
So I'm an only child. I'll say that. So my parents always kind of like wanted some more kids, but
Mhm.
they had some issues, stuff like that. And so it was just me growing up. My mom and dad, my dad was a deacon. My mom was always the financial secretary of the church. And so when I say stuff, it's like I grew up in the church. I mean, I was the random weird kid from time to time, like running through the basement of the old First Baptist Church, because it's kind of what we did. And so it's just kind of really interesting. It's like in the back of my mind, I always had this idea that I was going to be in ministry somewhere, doing something. I just didn't really know at all what that was. And so it's like, and I remember from just a young age, you talked a little bit about like weird parts of the Bible. So I remember my dad would just sit down with me and we'd read some of these stories, and then he would stop and he'd be like, "Man, Dustin, that's kind of funky. What do you think about that?" And then so even like as a young kid, I'm like, "I have no idea what the Nephilim are, Dad." You
Right.
know? It's like I have no idea what I think either. But
Yeah.
it's just that was at least, for being raised, I was always just kind of raised with this idea that it's okay to think and kind of question. And also, wherever God calls, He's going to use you. And so it was, I've been a carpenter for a little bit. I've worked in radio too for just a little bit. And it was like, even in those areas of my life, I can still see where God has worked, even through those little weird things, that I did for like 6 months. And so it's just really cool and interesting kind of to have my parents who are just supportive of that. And then now I've got 3 kids and my wife, we're kind of doing the same thing, with this camp ministry thing that you work like mad for 3 months out of the year and then you don't do much, for the rest
Yeah.
couple months. And so it's just interesting kind of looking back and seeing where God has moved and taken me just with the willingness to follow wherever that call goes. And so
Yeah.
I guess that answers the question. I don't know.
Yeah.
Maybe,
No, that.
hopefully.
Yeah, I actually had a couple of questions. You kind of answered 2 or 3 of them in one swoop, so that's pretty nice. And it's funny, my story, there's some similarities in there as well. When my mom got saved and came back to church when I was about 3 years old, and it was one of those, we were there every time the door was open. She was a part of every committee, everything in the church, and just like a real radical change of life, which is amazing. But we were there all the time, taking mini naps in the pews. We've done the army crawls under the pews, all the fun stuff. But whenever I felt like God was calling me to ministry, I've always wanted to do something for God. When I was young, I was very excited with Indiana Jones and wanted to be an archaeologist, but I wanted
Ooh,
to kind
that'd
of
be fun.
study some of the biblical areas and stuff. Maybe not run away from boulders, but all that sort of things. But whenever God called me to ministry, it was a weird season because all I got was just general like ministry. I had other friends, especially when I went off to college and stuff for pastoral stuff. People like, well, I'm going to be a pastor. I'm going to be a youth pastor or a missionary. I'm going to do this thing or that thing. I'm like, that's great for you. You guys have a clear answer. Just got ministry in general. So I'm going to go with whatever the doors open at, and I'm going to serve and be faithful and all of that as time goes on, and just kind of allow God to lead me wherever. And if I see an open door, we'll shoot for it. And so
Yeah,
that's kind of
exactly.
where I've gone. So,
Well,
um,
and I'll say my dad always told me kind of right at the very beginning when I was like, okay, maybe I'm called to vocational ministry. I remember my dad saying one day, he was like, son, just remember being called to ministry is one thing. That means you may be a youth pastor, you may be a pastor, you may work in camp ministry, you may just be a deacon, you may be this, that, or the other. It's like ministry isn't, well, I'm just called to youth ministry. Doesn't mean you're going to be a youth minister for the rest of your life. Because, man, I loved being a youth minister, but I'll be honest, now that I'm not a youth minister, I'm like, you know, I don't mind not having to chase kids around all the time.
and I'm still a youth pastor about 8 years in now, and it's funny the lock-ins start to feel a lot longer the older I get.
Yeah, they do.
I
Oh yeah,
mean,
they do.
they're a blast, but still, it's the um, I always kind of need to go up to the youth room and sleep after everyone leaves for a little bit before, just so
Yeah.
I can safe to drive home.
Those
But
those camp bunks never get any softer. Those camp bunks are always just as hard as I remember.
well, let me just kind of take this in a slightly different direction, real quick, before we get into some of the really cool, weird Bible stories as far as camp wise. Is there any like interesting like? So I guess first of all, is the camp ministry? Is this a camp that you did you start the camp or did you kind of come into working the camp?
So that I mean that's kind of an interesting story in itself. And so I've done camp ministry from like 2 or 3 different sides of it. I've done it from the programming side of it, which is what I've done for years now. And then I've also done it from the encampment side of it as like the maintenance director.
Sure.
And really from like the programming side of it, the camps that we're running now we took them over, but at the time the people running them, I guess, weren't doing very well with them. And so the reason we took them over was because they're like, hey, we just don't feel called to do this anymore. And it was really interesting. Like they show up to me and my the pastor at the time, because I was a student minister, they show up to our office and they're like, basically they're like, we don't want to do this anymore. Here, you're going to do this. And I kind of remember looking at my pastor at the time and I'm like, hey, so are we actually going to do this? And he goes, well, technically you are, and I'll help you. And I'm like, oh, cool beans. And it's like, we'll kind of work it, but it's kind of been a mix of, yes, we got handed kind of an already camp week that's been working. That one was a preteen camp. And so since then, we've grown that preteen camp into 2 sessions of preteen camp, which is back to back, which may be the dumbest thing I've done because it's like almost straight because there's no off day in between. It's when one camp leaves that morning or that evening, the next camp comes on that morning. And then, but then we've also started doing like youth leadership type retreats. There's a Howard Payne University is a college that's in town where I live, and they've allowed us to use their facilities in the summer to do kind of more of a what do you call it? Student leadership type camp. So it's not necessarily it's a youth camp, but it's more for the student leaders. And so we've done that for 2 sessions, and then we're trying this year. I'll let you know how it goes after we're done.
Ooh,
And but we're trying to do maybe more of kind of like a wilderness type camp too,
okay.
since I like outdoors and stuff. But registration for that one is not as big, which is totally fine. I think it's going to be a ton of fun, but at the same time, I'm like, I really hope we can make a fire and eat, you know?
Yeah. It might be easier as a slightly smaller crowd because if you pull in, I'm just throwing up numbers here, pull in 500 people for wilderness or survival training, at least four of them aren't going to make it. So, you know,
Oh yeah, and I mean, it's
smaller
a
numbers.
pretty big area where we're having it, and it's like 100 acres, and so I'm like, I know I can lose a kid in 100 acres. Like I know I can.
As long as that's a warning and not a challenge.
Yeah. But I hope that kind of answers that one because I mean it's still a learning curve, especially with the preteen camp. Like this year, it's like, oh man, I've ran this camp. This is the first camp we've run. I know what I'm doing. I know how many rec team I need. But then like something will come up and be like, well, that's different. Well, okay, God, how do I need to approach this situation? And a lot of it has been it's interesting to say, but it's like even like asking God for like the little answers in your life. It's like somehow they just come up and they come to you and you're like, well, okay, thanks, Lord. I know that was you who made me figure out this problem because if it was Dustin, it's not getting figured out.
Right. Yeah, I feel that. So, man, I feel like there's so many different ways I could talk to you all day about, but one of the things I think was really interesting is how you were reading about some of the weirder Bible stories, and it's not just weird, but things that are overlooked. There might be certain phrases that when it's translated into English, it doesn't quite uh, give this have that doesn't quite have the same ring to it as we do,
Yeah.
as probably the original audience would have heard or read it. I know you talked about like Genesis 6, kind of the pre-flood. You mentioned Nephilim already. Can you give us just a little bit of a breakdown of what the Nephilim are and what kind of got your interest into this topic?
That's a big breakdown. Let's just go ahead. I've done like full episodes on what the Nephilim are, and I'm still not totally sure I know.
And I will
But
say, for
so
you, you can go and listen to your whole podcast over at Raising the Wild Ones if you want to like a big full-on, understanding. But just kind of a quick, teaser. What do you got?
So, like, I guess what really interested me in the podcast is I was really thinking about this when you sent me that list. I was read through that question and I thought I could start kind of with this story and then we can segue and kind of go into the Nephilim. Is I did a youth series when I was first a youth pastor, and basically what that series was it was the story Bible stories we've all been taught like in VBS or whatever, but maybe that we don't really understand. And I was going through some of these stuff like Jonah and the whale, right? Like we all get taught that he ran from God, he gets swallowed in the whale, and then all of a sudden he gets thrown up. But it's like we don't really talk about much at the end where still Jonah's like, I'm gonna go sit on this hill over here and hope that God destroys Nineveh. And it's like that end part of the story, or it's like for me, it's like with David and Goliath, it's like, well, okay, David picks up 5 stones. It's like, well, he knows that God's going to help him. He knows that God's going to be the basically what's going to destroy Goliath. Why did he pick up 5 stones? And that was the one that I really started kind of digging into and looking at. And it's like, wait a minute, Goliath had brothers. And it's like, was David ready like to possibly tear out his brothers? And I know that's like from extra biblical material too, is where we get that from too, not necessarily just from the Bible, but it's like, man. And so then you start looking like, well, okay, well, what's Goliath? Is Goliath a giant? Well, what's a giant? What's it mean? And then there's a lot of debate on like what cubit you're going to use. How big was Goliath actually? I'm like, but I mean, it's like some translations of that put him at like 12 foot. And I'm like, that's not just a tall guy. He's not just a one-off big dude. And I'm like, well, okay, well then where did all this kind of come back? And I remember as a kid just kind of talking to my dad, like, what's up with that? What's up with this Goliath guy? Why is he big? And and why are there some aspects of the Bible that we almost kind of like glaze over and maybe don't I don't want to say we don't teach as much because I've heard sermons on David and Goliath and I've heard sermons on these things and but it's like maybe we don't understand and nobody's willing just to go, hey man, there's this really weird part of Job where, God is like standing in a council and Job and Satan just kind of shows up and he's like, "Hey, man." And it's like, Hold up, God's got a council?" It's like, what? It's like we could talk about that and look at that, but and then it's like that kind of really all brought me back to like Genesis 6. And when we get the idea of Genesis 6, I mean, it says that the sons of God came down, and whether you want to translate that, I tend to kind of go with the sons of the God. Sons of God are the fallen demons that have like come down at this point. And it says they've seen the daughters of man, and they thought they were good and wanted to marry them, have relations and stuff like that. And so then that thing goes on, and then there's this deal that says, and then the Nephilim were on the earth in those days. And it's like, well, okay. And so this is where it gets fun because you could kind of go a couple different ways. Were the Nephilim already there, or were they the offspring of this sons of God, whole deal? And then you get to the whole idea where it says, further on in that story where it's like, and the hearts of man were nothing but pure evil. And it's like, oh geez, like that's rough. And it's a lot of stuff to start unpack. And you kind of push it all the way back to this whole idea with the sons of God. And it's like, that's weird, and then even like one of my favorite Bible verses is in First Peter 3:20. I really should have Googled that before and had that Bible verse open. That's my bad. But it's towards the end of First Peter in chapter 3, where it basically talks about like after Jesus died, he appeared to these spirits and he proclaimed to them. And it's like, if you look at this passage and you kind of break it, I'm a Greek guy. It's just that's my thing. I like it. And you break it down, it's not that he went to like preach them the gospel because the wording's different. It's not that he went to go tell them about Jesus. It's almost like he went down to the spirits that disobeyed in the time of Noah just to say, "You guys stink. I won." And it's like, it's almost the feeling that you get, whether it's actually that or not. And it's like, well, okay, so now we've got kind of the tie between these sons of God and Nephilim all the way into First Peter in the New Testament. And it's like, well, how do all these little weird things, fit into the whole story of Jesus? And when you really start thinking about it, the stuff that we don't think's weird, I mean, Jesus was resurrected. I mean, he died for our sins. He took our sins upon himself. I mean, to the normal person, that sounds weird right there too. And it's just
Yeah.
using these little things to kind of piece the Bible and look at the Bible through more of a, man, our God is awesome. Not like that's weird. Let's talk about just focus on this one thing, but kind of ultimately point it back towards, man, look at this awesome thing our God did through David in defeating a giant that he shouldn't have been able to defeat. And don't even get me started at the end of that one. Like he chops his head off. Nobody ever like has a VBS Bible story where like they're like, oh yeah, by the way, at the end of this, David like cut off Goliath's head.
Well, like in VBS, like there's all open crafts, there's reenactments, and I don't know how that's going to go with a bunch of 6-year-olds.
Oh no.
Could you imagine if there was, sometimes with VBS, there's you got church kids from your church, from other churches, and sometimes parents are saying, I could use a few hours alone.
Oh yeah.
Don't go to church, send your kids there. They come back with like some paper machete, head or paper mache, not machete, but paper mache head or something. It's like, okay, what did you guys do there? But yeah, so I
We
usually
did
call
a thing. Oh no,
it,
go ahead, man.
I was
Oh,
gonna,
we
I
did a
usually call
thing with,
it for Sunday school stories.
yeah. I mean, I feel you because me and Caleb, which is the co-host of the podcast that I do, I mean, we go to Sunday school together too. And we were in Sunday school one day with all of our, and it's the young adults families class. I don't know if there's more than just young
Mhm.
families, but he's like, hey, has anybody ever like done a coloring page of like David like cutting the head off of Goliath? And I'm like, no, no, nobody's ever done that, Caleb. And he goes, I'm gonna do it. And so then like 2 or 3 days later, he sends me this coloring page, and it's just like this little kid holding up the head. I mean, it's not gruesome in any way. And I'm like, you need to send that to our children's director and see what they have to say. And then we did, and they're like, we're never doing this. And I'm like, yeah, I know, it's fine.
Oh, that's awesome. Whenever I've seen like these like quote unquote like adult coloring books, it's like the real detailed, color number 23 red or
Yeah.
whatever. And like, that's a perfect avenue to actually do some of the more gruesome ones. And maybe you would get more guys involved in that. It's still peaceful, but you're also seeing, man,
Hey man.
there's so many of these great stories in the Bible. But I guess, like you said, there's especially before the flood, uh, there. So my discipline is more on the literary genre, the historical, like how the original audience would receive. That's kind of my or more
Ooh,
my
yeah.
discipline. And you actually have all of Genesis 1 through 11 is its own unique genre, and then Genesis 12, where you have Abraham and on, is a little different. And so the way that my understanding of really all of Genesis, but including this, is Moses is essentially giving the Israelites while they're after they've escaped Egypt, they're in the in the wilderness, getting ready to go into the promised land, they're receiving the law of God and all of this, but they're also getting a good solid like background of this is where you came from, this is why we're in this situation, and so they're getting all of this before they even go in. And there's in how people read it is one thing, but you have the 12 spies that went into the land of Canaan, and like we were like grasshoppers. So it's like, are you mean like a metaphor, or were you actually a grasshopper? Could it be somewhere between where maybe
Well,
they're not 30 foot tall, but maybe they're 12 foot tall? Like
and
what?
even
How?
along those same
Yeah,
lines, I mean, they talk about the grapes that they brought back too. I mean, they had a grapes that two guys had to carry, and it's like, well, okay, and that it kind of almost gives you an idea of, well, if their grapes are this massive, why are they not also possibly just as big? And now at that point, they had definitely mixed around, and it's not like everyone was these huge giants, but they were there. And I mean, and I mean, it brings kind of like a whole new historical context, at least for me, to the Old Testament and looking towards into the Greek and stuff. And a lot of the translations you get in giants also comes from the Greek Septuagint. They get a lot of that in the Old Testament, which I'm a Greek guy, so I like the Septuagint. You
yeah.
know,
And I've got a good idea, but for anyone who's listening to this, if we're kind of nerding out over theology and stuff, can you just tell somebody real quick in a couple of sentences what is the Greek Septuagint?
the Greek Septuagint is basically the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible by Hellenistic Jews. Man, I should have known that date, but by the Hellenistic Jews, in the Second Temple Judaism, right? Was they Second Temple, or was it
That's
past Second
about,
Temple?
I think it's about,
It's yeah, somewhere on there. But and so these Hellenistic Jews basically they kind of translate the Old Testament into the Greek, and that's where you get the Septuagint. So what's really interesting with that is the Hellenistic Jews favored like heavy spirituality and heavy spiritual when it came to of the Old Testament. And so they were very like they would see stuff like words like the Nephilim, or they'd see stuff like I want to say it's like Gibborim, which is the Hebrew word that's normally translated as like mighty men. And they would see that and they'd be like, well, okay, so what does that mean? And they would kind of look at the context and go, well, that's a giant. They're getting at like giant right here. And so they would kind of lean more heavily towards the spiritual aspects of the Old Testament. And so that's just kind of, and I like looking at that mainly because I'm a Greek guy, and because I'll be honest, I took one semester of Hebrew, and ooh, that's
at least with
that's
Greek,
that's
we're
some stuff.
using close to the same alphabet. Like Hebrew, ancient Hebrew is
Yeah,
it might as it might as well be something like Chinese, to me, or something of that nature. Like the symbols are just they're nothing alike, and Greek is getting closer to the type of alphabet that I don't know what the term is,
yeah.
but the type of alphabet that we have today. But yeah, so one of the things I do like about that, again, I'm probably just geeking out a little bit too much here, but the translating it into the Greek, this was in it basically keeping it accessible for anyone to be able to read. And I think that's something that's very important throughout the Bible, throughout the millennia now that we've had, where it's intended to be accessible for anyone to be
Yeah.
able to have access to. Um, so that's just kind of a little extra nugget there. So let me, I guess, maybe ask you kind of in this way. Some of these really cool, like the spiritual side of things, like I said, the mighty men, or like the Nephilim, or the giants, or was it the divine council? Some of these things that go a little bit beyond just a basic modern English American understanding. Like, how has that maybe shifted the way that you read the Bible, other passages of the Bible? Has that shifted anything, or does that like do you take a different approach to uh, you know, examining, let's say John 3:16 versus Genesis 6?
You bring up like John 3:16. I mean, it's really interesting to think of. It's a simple passage, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son. See, I memorized that one like in
Yeah.
King James way back in the day, so it's like always going to be here in that. But the only begotten son that whomsoever shall believe in him shall not perish but have eternal life. And so it's like even like a small passage like that, you kind of think about the idea and you think about some of these people in the Old Testament, and you're like God still died for them as well. It's like God died for all mankind, not just the select few. And I will say it maybe it doesn't change like what the New Testament means at all, but it maybe changes the idea you would kind of look at the New Testament through a lens of when Jesus showed up on the scene, he shows up to these people who are like almost like super spiritual, and they're trying to figure out some of these things. And some of these stories, they're like, oh yeah, there were giants around. Oh yeah, there was this around. Oh yeah, there was this. There's stories you even get into the whole like spiritual thing, which ancient Hebrews believed in this creature called Lilith, which is translated in First Kings somewhere as like the night witch. And it's really weird. That's like way out there, by the way. I'm not sure
Oh,
where I believe and stand on this one. I'm still digging into it. But it's like some of these early Jewish people are like, oh yeah, Lilith is totally a thing. And it's like, well, what in the world? And it's like, how does this all work? And it's like, and when Jesus shows up on the scene, like he shows up as the guy that's like, yeah, if Lilith is a thing, I'm gonna conquer her. I'm gonna take care of it. Don't worry, guys. And it's just even the idea that when he died on the cross, it's like it's the idea of he's taking care of all of this dark, and because most of the stuff when you start talking about giants, it's not the good guys hanging around doing good things. I mean, the Nephilim, the sons of God, the giants, all those sorts of things. Even the story where you're talking about the divine council, what's going on there? Like Satan is roaming around, like trying to find somebody, and then he's up at God, and God's like, hey man, what about Job? And it's like, well, okay, so it's it makes you kind of take a step back and look at Jesus and see just what he has overcome for us, you know, to allow us to be able to sit there, and it makes us maybe more focused on what the scripture and what that actually means to us instead of just almost the idea of, oh, yep, Jesus overcame sin. Yep, he took on our sin. He died on the cross, which is all awesome stuff. But it's like, man, in doing that, he bound death. He destroyed it. And it's like, are we also going to die? Yeah, we're also going to die, but it's not going to be the same kind of death as it was because Jesus took care of that. And then it even gets really, really interesting when you start thinking about the idea of this is also another theory. If it's a theory that I'm not 1,000% sure I'm on board with,
yeah.
totally gonna say that. But it's the idea that even with the whole sons of God thing, that maybe these, demons knew what Jesus was going to do, or not what Jesus was going to do, but they're trying to mess up the whole thing. It's like, let's go mess with man and let's see if maybe we could like pollute the bloodline somehow or do something like that. And so then it's like, well, okay, it's everything in the Old Testament kind of points towards Jesus. Well, maybe the sons of God is even pointing towards, let's see if we can screw that up, and it's like now that's a ton of extra biblical stuff. That's getting into a little bit of like the Book of Enoch, which yes, some of the Book of Enoch may be, written, before Jesus, but I'll go on record as saying that my view on the Book of Enoch is great to understand early, especially Second Temple Judaism, but it is not scripture. We have our scriptures, and so it's awesome. It's cool stuff, but even it's weird. I was talking to somebody about this about the Book of Enoch earlier. Is even the Book of Enoch doesn't read like the Bible does. And you're like, well, it's written but it doesn't. I mean, you're reading through the book of Enoch and then you read through Genesis and you're like, these just read different. And so it kind of makes you sit there and go, okay, cool. It's cool to understand like historical setting on what's going on when that book was written. But at the same time, it's like, but kind of to bring it all back, it's like, it makes you kind of step back and see maybe the great deceiver's trying to like mess up Jesus so much through the Old Testament. Even in the idea of David and Goliath. I mean, what if Goliath had killed David? What if there's something weird going on there? It's like it's interesting kind of to see this idea of what if like, Satan the great deceiver's like, hey, Goliath, you're up, buddy. Go try to take out David. Which this is all reading into scripture, and I know that. It doesn't say that at all in the
Take
story.
it with the salt, do it with caution,
Yeah,
absolutely.
but and see, I'm also like very vivid, like imaginary type guy, and so it's like it's interesting kind of when you take a look at the New Testament and you see what Jesus has done and what like Paul's written about and all those sorts of things, and you stop and you look back at the Old Testament and you're like, huh, I wonder, and it's like I wonder if Satan's just trying to you know fight this, hit this, hurt that, and it didn't work, and we
And what I would say that, the idea of the devil or Satan trying to, thwart the plan of God in one way or another, it seems to be a constant factor. Just the method might be changing. And as you were talking there, it made me think about an observation that I think many have made is in the Old Testament, we don't really hear a whole lot of demons in particular. There's not a lot of exorcisms that we see, but when Jesus comes on the scene, there's demons and there's plenty of exorcisms. And even to a point where there were some of the places, and it wasn't just Jesus, but there were plenty of Jewish exorcists as well. And I think it's either in Acts or in some of the stories around Paul and some of the early apostles, they're running into people who are trying to, exorcise or cast out demons in some way or another. And it's like, okay, it's interesting. The Old Testament doesn't really have that, at least that element in that way, but the New Testament does. And again, within my training, I'm kind of thinking like, did something new happen, or is this the similar kind of thing that's happened, but like 400 years separate? So if anyone is not too familiar, there's about roughly 400 years between the last words of the Old Testament to the New Testament being written, and within those 400 years, you have the Greek world, you have the Persians, Babylonians, all of those, and then historically you also have the Romans who kind of taken over everything now, and the whole like worldview, the Roman and Greco-Roman like worldview, philosophy, religion, all of that is kind of on the scene now, and within history, as close as we would have to modernity is that. So even in that time frame, a lot of the belief in a lot of the gods like Zeus, Diana, Hermes, all these sort of things, the the focus on the godlike side of those have started to decrease a bit in favor of philosophy, which is very similar to what we have today. And so, could it be that we just categorize things so simply as like demons today, when they had a little bit more nuance and maybe details in the Old Testament? And then the last thing I have with that, and curious on your thoughts on this, would be the book of Ephesians. Talks about things like principalities, powers, rulers over the darkness of this age. And it actually, and when you're reading those, and again, I'm not the Greek expert, but it looks like these are actually very specific things Paul's mentioning. He doesn't give like a name, like a principality of blank, but he does seem to be calling out like these are three separate things. Or I think there's a fourth one throughout the book as well, but like these all seem to be like they're not just demons. There's more
yeah.
to it than that. And so anyway, I know I covered like a wide range of stuff there, but do you have any thoughts on that? Maybe the division of like why it looks a little bit different from the New Testament and the Old Testament, or
Well, and even I'll say okay, I'll start with kind of maybe a division of the Old Testament to New Testament, and then move on to the whole principalities thing. Because I was actually looking at that Ephesians passage. It's probably been about a month now, but I was you're trying to keep your sword sharp, so I was trying to translate some stuff, and I was like, I'm just gonna piddle fart with this one, and then I get to that passage, and I'm like, ooh, cool beans, you know. But it's like the one thing I will say, like in the Old Testament, which is really interesting, is you do it's not as prevalent, which is interesting because it seems to me like maybe it's more accepted by those outside of the Judaism,
Mhm.
but it's the idea of what Saul goes and consults a medium because what's this in First Chronicles 10-ish, right?
somewhere in that ballpark. I forget which one. Is it Chronicles or Samuel?
Maybe.
Hey, yeah,
See,
Samuel
I
covers
need to be
uh, uh, David and Saul.
I need to be quicker to Google. I'm a slow Google. But so Saul goes to consult this medium basically because he wants to talk to what's his name? He wants to bring back and like have like a conversation and talk to Elijah? No. See, I'm
I
totally
think
missing this one.
Elisha. I'm
Yeah,
pretty sure.
Elisha. So he wants to talk to him, and so basically goes to this medium, and he's like, "Hey, I want to talk to this." And then all of a sudden, the medium does her thing, and then he appears, and it's almost like the medium gets freaked out because then he can get into an idea of like maybe that wasn't her like demon spirit she's been talking to normally to do her medium things, and it's actually worked. And it's like, oh my goodness, you know? And so it's like, it's the idea of it probably wasn't as prevalent in Judaism, but outside of Judaism, it might have just been as prevalent. And then you start into the whole idea of like when you start talking about like Zeus and Jupiter and like all these different gods and stuff like that. Kind of one thing I've thought about, which was really interesting, is when Jesus is like standing up and Satan is tempting Jesus. I halfway have the thought in my mind that he's showing them all these places and be like, hey, you see how they worship Jupiter over there? They're just worshiping me in a different look. You see how they're worshiping Zeus over there? Oh, those guys, they're just worshiping me, but it looks different. You see how those guys way over there in like Norway are worshiping, Thor, Odin. It's just me, but it looks different. And so it's like, it's the idea of if you bow down and worship me, I'll go away and you can, and Jesus at that point, quotes scripture and says, no, we're not doing this. And I will not bow down and worship you. But it's like the idea of Satan maybe is manifesting himself in these different areas. And then you've got the whole idea of like territorial spirits. And you start getting into Ephesians where it's like the different ideas that maybe there are these different spirits that were set over these lands to keep control over them, keep territory. And Satan has corrupted these spirits, and thus they are loyal to him in some way. I mean, you're starting to get the medievals did a ton on like classifying angels and classifying demons. And in a lot of ways, I think they kind of went too far because I guess they just like their classifications. But it really kind of makes you look in different places because it's even weird to kind of think about the idea, but have you ever like landed somewhere in a town, flown somewhere, and when you get there, you get off the plane and it's just dark. You don't know why. You just feel kind of oppressed and you're like, okay, what's wrong here? What's wrong there? And I haven't really done a ton of world traveling at all. And when I say a ton, like none much, but I went to Cuba on a mission trip. And I remember when I got to Cuba, it was like we get there and I'm like, this place is dark. And then we start seeing like the, open witches, they're wearing all white, which is really interesting to think about because they're trying to, it's kind of talks about how Satan is a masquerades in light, masquerades. And it's like, you see this and it's like, well, is there something more here? Is evil just more prevalent here, or is there something larger at play, kind of towards the territorial spirits that maybe has a hold over this? And it's a real interesting idea. And I mean, you're spot on when you look at that Ephesians passage, because when I was translating through that, it's not like, oh, hey, these are some of the things that could be out here, but it's like it's either going to be A, B, or C. And it's like these are three separate entity type things. And it even gets interesting in the whole idea of, I mean, I was looking at this the other day, but even elemental spirits, which is interesting because there's a couple passages that almost discusses this idea of elemental spirits, which I'm just starting to look into that one. So I'm not totally sure, where I stand into that one. But even the whole Greek translation, it's more of just, oh, these are the things that war against us, the earth kind of war against us. But it's like maybe there's a little bit more there. So it's like, what is that little bit more, and how does it really kind of fit into spiritual warfare as a whole? Because now we're almost kind of getting into a topic on, spiritual warfare here, which is, well, that one's a doozy too.
Great. Well, let me see if I can tie a couple of these threads together here. First of all, I can bring Star Wars into this very easily,
Yeah.
accidentally. So it was First Samuel 28 was Saul and the Witch of Endor, which is my like. Well, okay, if that's the sci-fi phrase I've ever heard, yeah, there's you go with Endor. But with Ephesians, I've done a few different studies on Ephesians. We were talking before we recorded. I had to spend about over about 4 or 5 days. I had to spend about 45 hours writing, a paper on Ephesians. That was very rough. But one of the things that was really interesting, I mentioned a few minutes ago about how a lot of the ideas of the gods were kind of being replaced by philosophy. Uh, Ephesus was different. Ephesus was a very large city, but at like geographically, the way it's set up is it's on a bit of a hill, and at the top of the hill was one of the largest buildings in the ancient world, which was the Temple of Artemis. And Ephesus, being wealthy and all of that sort of stuff, they had very good reasons to love Artemis or Diana, depending on whether you're Greek or Roman. And in Acts chapter, I think it's 19, if anyone wants to read it, it's a wild story where Paul is going around, he's preaching, and people are, giving up some of their witchcraft books or burning them and getting rid of them, and people stopped buying uh, these idols or these statues of Artemis. And there was a major uproar. It started messing with the economy too, and like there was a major outcry. It said they filled like the was it the amphitheater they had, and the really cool
Yeah,
thing
yeah.
that'll fit about 24 to 25,000 people. So like any like college basketball arena, that many people were like yelling in unison, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians!" Like so, they still had a very big, hold on this on like deified, Artemis. And when Paul's writing, again, it's part of my discipline is like trying to get to the best of your ability into the mind of the original audience. And so when Paul's writing to the church in Ephesus, this is kind of their environment. This is kind of the water they're swimming in is all around. And when they, depending on exactly when Paul wrote it, we're just talking about a decade or two later, there was this mighty outroar, in the city. It's like, okay, so we definitely don't like these Christians who are overthrowing, Artemis. And, you know, Paul's use of language is so brilliant in there, where he's talking about like if Christ is the head, and he's talking about I wish I can remember the exact verse, but basically that everything is under Christ's feet. And so it's like, you can almost imagine yourself if you were, at an Ephesian believer at the time. You can anytime you look up, you're in some way, figuratively and even literally, under the foot of Artemis. At her temple would have been higher, and it's like not only would that geographically been the case, but the city, everyone believed in this to the point where it's like you were also figuratively under Artemis's foot. But Paul's writing in about Jesus, and he said, no, 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 you guys got it wrong. If you look a little higher to heaven, you can see that Jesus has already conquered, and he's already above all of that. And all this kind of reminds me, I think you've mentioned a lot about Michael Heiser and some in your podcasts. And he talks a lot about this. I think it's Unseen Realm. I think it's his book. I can't remember, but
Yep.
yeah. But he talks a lot about some of these entities and all of this. And I've not read the book yet, but from my understanding from overviews and interviews that I've heard from him, when people bring up spiritual warfare for him, it's like, okay, so are we supposed to go to these territorial demons and start like, laying out anointing oil and doing all this sort of stuff? And he's like, the basics: prayer, read the Bible, be close with Jesus. Like yes, there are these crazy cosmic things that are going on that's way beyond our understanding, but we can also stick with what we definitely know from Scripture too. Like, let's just stick with the
Yeah.
fundamentals. At least start with the fundamentals there. Don't drop that in favor of going and doing some Jericho march around an entire state or something. It's a little.
Well, and I've heard a lot about well, I've heard that, well, I said I heard a lot. It's not a ton, but a couple times from different people saying, "Well, we've got to like pray over this area. We've got to go march over these ley lines of whatever." And it's like I understand that, but at least for me, it's like, I mean, what's the Great Commission tell us? We need to just tell people about Jesus. That's what we're here to do. We tell people about Jesus, and then God's going to take care of the rest. Because even like it's a small thing, at least for me, it's like Dustin can't save people. And if God told Dustin to try to save people, I'm gonna screw it up. I know I am. And
I
so
will.
it's
I'm
like,
really good at finding ways to mess things up.
yeah, I mean, I'd figure it out. I mean, it's pretty simple, but I'd figure it out. But it's like, but I can tell people about Jesus, and it's God the one that changes lives. And even a story that came to my mind. I was reading the other day, and I can't even really. It was some like article was talking about the different oracles of old, and it was like as Christianity spread across Europe and out of Rome and into Asia Minor, it's like all of a sudden these oracles that people were going to start talk to, like they fell silent. It talks about like the Oracle of Delphi at one point just stopped speaking and they couldn't connect anymore. And it's like, is that a correlation with Jesus being spread through the land, with people talking more about God? And in my opinion, I'm like, yes, that is. I mean, as Christianity is spread, the darkness is pushed out. And so, did people go like march around the oracle's house like 7 times, and then blow a trumpet and then pray to them? No, people just around that oracle learned about God. And, I guess that demon or however that was working, however the dark forces were working in that was like, it's not worth it anymore. And it's kind of almost the idea you start talking about deception and how deception has like shifted and how Satan has almost like changed his attack for today than he did there. I mean, because there was like people, okay, oracles, those sorts of things, more spiritual type stuff. We can go into like the false god worships, all that kind of stuff. Like this stuff was working. Like Satan was using these things to get people to look away from Jesus. But today it's like Satan's got to use different things. Satan's got to change his plan. He's got to change how he deceives because he's still deceiving. Just it's different. It's the idea. There's a passage. What's in Mark? I looked at it a minute ago. In Mark 3, verse what is it? It's in verse 25 towards the end of Mark. It says no, it's not it. Oh, no, no, it's in 27. My bad. In fact, no one can enter the strong man's house without first tying him up. Then he can plunder the strong man's house. And it's like, well, okay, that's true. But it's like, so what did God do? And Jesus, when he died, he bound the strong man. Well, are there still bad things going to happen? Yeah. Is it still going to be hard? Well, yeah. But Satan doesn't have the power maybe as he did, or maybe it just looks really different than it did back then. And so, I mean, it's interesting to kind of talk about a lot of that. And Stephen, we did a couple episodes on our podcast with a friend of mine, named Bobby Whitefield, and he's a missionary in Tanzania. And it's like, and he'll be the first one to tell you, he's like, man, Dustin, they're practicing witchcraft like just down the street. I mean, there's a shaman dude like right down the street from my house. And he goes, and guess what? That shaman dude does not like come and try to curse me. He just doesn't like to be around me. And it's like, you wonder why, and it's like, he's not like cursing me. He's not like trying to do these evil things and, get me to leave. It's like, it's almost like he knows. And Bobby told me, he's like, I'm pretty sure he knows like we're saved and that he can't, fight us, and it's like his power is not nearly as strong as God's power. God's power will always be evidence. Like you're talking about, God's the head, we're all under him and under his feet. And so that's just some
Yeah,
kind of fun stuff when you start getting into spiritual warfare.
yeah. There was. Are you familiar with the old? I think he's passed away now, but the old Christian musician Carmen.
Oh yeah, I think so.
Yeah. There was, I guess, some concert. They did a video with it. I was trying to look it up here real quick. I cannot remember the name of the song, but there's this one. It kind of deals with a bit of spiritual warfare, and as a kid, really freaked me out. Basically, there's some kind of guy. He's like a Satanist or something. Just a real, picturesque, like this is as bad as you get sort of thing. And preacher goes to his house. He sends him away, and basically in the middle of the night, these two. It looks like the graphics were like a really bad '80s uh, Ghostbusters style. These like glowing, green glowing skeleton demon things like drag this guy like through his bed down to hell, and it's like, and so like when I was younger, I'm like, oh my goodness, spiritual warfare. Like this is so
Yeah.
totally terrified, and it's not the that evil and darkness is better than that, but it's like they're as a Christian, we have a lot less reasons to be afraid than we think. Uh, and I know, if you don't mind, I know you used to have a story about. You said you worked at was a funeral home for a while.
Oh, the funeral home? Yeah, I did.
Yeah, you tell a really interesting story where there was like this dark presence and everything. Do you mind being able to share that for a little bit?
Yeah, I could share that one. It's an interesting one. And so yeah, I did. I worked at a funeral home. I was actually bivocational, and so it's when I first got into youth ministry. Before that, I was working as like a plumber, and so I needed to find another job in youth ministry. And so I first get into youth ministry. I start working at a funeral home, and so we do death calls at the funeral home. It's basically when somebody passes away. We were a small town. We didn't have a coroner's office or any of those fancy things. We were the ones that went to their house and picked them up. And for the most part, it was just very simple. People were sad always, but you just go pick up the remains and you bring them back. But you could always tell, like just almost right off the bat, if the family was saved or not, because just almost like the difference in sadness. It was like they're sad because they've lost someone they cared about. And it's the other one, like they're sad because they have no idea what has happened here. They have no idea where this person's gone. But the story I'm the story I'm talking about, I don't know. I've told it at one point on my podcast. I don't know if you've heard it before, but it's like we got called out one night and the whole thing was just eerie. I mean, it was weird. I mean, it's the middle of the night and I get it, but it's like it's the middle of the night, there's no wind, and I walk outside and I'm ready to go make this death call. and it's foggy. And I'm like, oh, this is eerie. This is creepy. And it's like, okay, all right, whatever. And so we get to the funeral home, and one of the things I always did at the funeral home while we were driving to the on call is we'd always pray. And I say, I just, hey God, I don't know what I'm gonna experience here. Because we did car accidents too, and some of those can get, pretty rough looking. And it's like, hey God, I don't know what I'm gonna experience when I get there today, God. So just help me to be able to do whatever I need to do, and just be with me and keep me safe as I go. It's a real simple, just prayer. And so I remember we're driving to this place, and it's just really foggy, and it's me and my boss. And at one point, he's like, "This is creepy," and I'm like, "And you've been doing this your whole life, man. Like, and this is the one you say that's creepy, right?" And it's like, okay. And so we get to the house, and it's like it has a circle drive, and we park in the middle of this circle drive, and we look at the door, and I'm like, it's like, man, there's something off here. I mean, there's something real off and something really weird about this house. And it's like, okay, God, and I remember just kind of sitting there, and it pops into my head, kind of really at that point, it's like, you're the light of the world. You're gonna be all right. I'm like, okay, all right, cool beans, and so we start walking and we open the door. And one of the first things I realize is there's like this dog in this back corner, and it's just upset. I mean, it's like not comforting like the family, it's just over there and upset. And I'm like, okay, that's weird. And you start talking about like little weird things that would happen. It's like the house felt cold. And I know you start listening to like paranormal stories and stuff, and they're like, and I felt a chill at the top of the stairs. It wasn't like that, but it was like the house just felt cold. I'm like, well, I mean, they might have the air conditioner turned down a little bit. Okay. And so you start kind of walking, and then it got like it felt like somebody physically like had my shoulders and was like pushing me down. And I'm like, this is weird. Like I could still walk, but it was almost like a labored type of a walk. And I'm like, okay. And I remember keep kind of looking over towards my boss. And he kept kind of and he'd have to go talk to the family and get information and all this kind of stuff. And so he kept okay, he didn't really like say anything. And then so we turn off and we take down to the hallway to where the guy is. And so as like we're going down the hallway, it's just feeling like darker, eerier. It's harder to walk, it's harder to step. And it's like, well, we've got to go in there. Like it's our job. We got to go in there. And this, and it's like, I don't know, like if I should have been like what the Catholics have like the crucifix and some holy water before I walk in there, but it's like we got to go in there. And I remember when we opened the door to walk in there, like it was like this is the source. Is really what it felt like. Whether how it was or not, it's like, man, this room here is dark. And he was just an older gentleman had passed away on the bed. And I mean, it wasn't gruesome. It's not like there were like, pentagrams on the walls. It was a normal room. And I remember like sitting there, and we had this moment, and I remember just looking down at my feet, and around my feet it was like there was this physical lightness, like just almost in a small circle around me. And like at that point, what I thought earlier, it's like God was like, you are the light of this world, Dustin. Like in I am the light, and I am in you, and you are the light of the world. And I'm like, oh my gosh. And I remember even looking over at my boss, and same kind of thing. And all we said in this moment is I looked at him and I'm like, you see that? And he goes, yep. And then we did it. And we took him, put him on the gurneys. But it's like the whole time it's just like it was just pushing down on me, and it's just so oppressive. And the family was just wailing, just so, just not just sad, but I mean just distraught, and like almost these pained screams. And it's like, and the only thing I could think of do is talk about pray. It's like I mean, just in my head as I'm walking through this house, I'm like, God, I don't know what to do here, man. Like, I'm pretty sure if I started, telling these people about Jesus, things may start flying at me at this point. I don't know,
Right.
and it's like, and so, but it's like the idea of like in that moment, I was like, I just pray. And it's like, did anything immediately change? No. Did I feel maybe a little better? Maybe so. But it's like, did I ever feel like I was in danger? And it's like, no, I didn't. Because it's like I had this inside of me. It's like, Dustin, you're the light of the world. In you there is no darkness, and you're just shining your light. And right now, Dustin, that light may look pretty dim, but you're still shining it. It's just in a pretty dark place. And I remember we finished that one. Even I'm not sure as I did it with, I shared this one of my episodes too, and I don't think I shared this part because they did a funeral and they didn't do a funeral at a church, which was kind of expected because it was like I could have like after that experience, it was like they probably don't want to go into a church for whatever reason. So they did one at our little chapel in our, in our funeral home. And I remember even that I had to drive the family car in the funeral procession when you're going. And so I was driving the family car and they were just like distraught. I mean, every single one of them was just crying this almost, I don't want to say like uncontrollable cry, but it almost was just this uncontrollable, there is no hope left. And the guy who did the funeral, like, gave an open presentation. I mean, he told the gospel at the end of it, and he told him, like, hey, there's hope for you, and it was just like, and I kept thinking, like, what has attached itself to this family? And it almost felt like something is making them. And it's almost like, I don't want to say like demons, but it's like in my mind, it's like, I wonder if there's some sort of demon attachment or something to this family that's like making them almost think there is no hope. And it's like, there is hope. There's always hope. There's hope in Jesus Christ. But it's like, man, there was a couple other ones that weren't like near that bad, but it's like you could always tell because I mean it was like somebody physically pushing you down. It's like it's almost it's almost like you're walking through sand. And so I could sit there and think about if you've ever like tried to just walk through sand, like it's just a little slower and
Yeah.
harder, and it's like I mean, it's interesting. That funeral was some fun times because I mean, I was just in youth ministry. I hadn't even gone through any of my theological training yet, so I'm just trying to like think through all this stuff as like really a kid because that's all I was a kid, and it's like, okay, God, but I remember it's like you are the light of the world, and it's like if that's what I am, then I'm gonna shine my light, you know?
I think, you know, it is really fun trying to look at some of these really interesting parts of the Bible. Is it revealing things about, principalities and powers and giants and all this sort of stuff? But there is a bit of vagueness to it throughout Scripture. It's not like here's the Ten Commandments and here's some explicit details over what a Nephilim is and what is this. And so
Yeah,
there's a bit of vagueness to it. And I wonder if part of that is not just God and his wisdom, um, not painting such a clear picture that becomes our object of worship or fear. That Scripture does a lot better job at painting who Jesus is, and we can tell. I think most people, even in our world that we live in today, where we want a nice, clean answer, scientific, material answer to everything, and that there is. Maybe there is the AC on instead of there's a chill or whatever.
yeah.
The deal is maybe he had some weird lighting that you didn't
Didn't
see while they were
see.
going around. Yeah, there's
Yeah,
some your eyes play tricks on you, whatever the deal is. And in some ways it's comforting to have those answers because we don't have to deal with these other heavy things. But I think a lot of people, if we're honest, we could say that we have at least most people I would say have at least one experience of something within whether you want to call it paranormal or spiritual beyond the material universe. We all have most people have something, and some people do tend to have several some things that
yeah,
happen. And if anything else, it's almost like, hey, here's an indicator that there's something more than just this, more than just our particular, five senses of existence. The taste, such, and all that. That there is some, but there is something, more than that. So throughout the Bible, and like we mentioned in Ephesians, there is something more out there, but more than there might be something above you or challenging you or wherever you're at. Is there's something above that, and there's Jesus, and
yeah,
He's already won. And there's, one of the other stuff, that at least kind of in my tradition, talk about the already and the not yet. We're like Jesus has already won, and we're going to be able to experience that. We're not there in heaven yet, but we do get glimpses of this already in here in this existence as well. I don't think that the episode would be entirely complete. I know we're kind of running towards the end of the time, but what, in your view, are things like, um, and this might be a little bit of, blindsided here, but things like Bigfoot, Yeti, that sort of stuff. There's even, I think the term is cryptids, but where I am in Kentucky, not too far, there's one called the Pope Lick Monster. I don't know if you've ever heard of that one. This is like half goat, half man that lures people out onto this old railroad trellis,
So
and it's not so it's not so pretty. Um, but is that just extra fun stuff, or does that actually fit into any of the stuff that you've talked about?
we're going to start. You could start talking about cryptids. You could almost go the way of, when the sons of God came down. If you go the whole idea of they're messing with the genetics of mankind, trying to possibly stop Jesus, you could. You see, you're getting into the Book of Enoch here, really, when you're going this way. But talk about messing with the genetics of man, animals as well. A good friend of mine, and he's done a couple of episodes on our podcast. And so he talks about the idea of like maybe some of like this super hardcore dinosaurs, were
Okay.
part of this like idea of like the T-Rex and like all these like really bad ones and stuff were maybe genetic messed with like sons of God. So you could go the whole idea of maybe the sons of God like messed genetics in this stuff. But where things get really interesting, you kind of ask like kind of what I thought on this one is in Central Texas, you talk about the goat man. All right. Here in Central Texas, there's multiple like stories and ideas of the goat man. And my great grandfather, like I remember he was half Native American, but it's really interesting because he was like staunch Baptist. So it was like this really like weird mix, man. Like I'll be honest, like there'd be times where I'd go hunting and stuff like that, and so we'd shoot the deer and we'd be harvesting the deer and we'd be like gutting it and stuff. And he's like, "Now, Dustin, you take a bite of the heart to embody the speed of the animal." And I'm like, "Paul, that's not how that works." And he goes, "Yeah, I know, but And it's like, what? It's like your Native Americans coming out there, Paul, a little bit. And but he will tell you, like, and I remember like hearing stories of like hunting when I was little. He's like, "Hey man, you be watch out. There's goat mens out here." And I'm like, "There's what?" And then like and now you're on edge as like a 12-year-old boy sitting out there hunting and you're like, "Oh my goodness, I'm gonna see the goat man. What am I gonna do?" But he talks about the idea of he had an experience in the woods one night about how he was just kind of walking through the woods, heading to go check on his sheep. And when he got to his sheep, one of his sheep had died, and it was a pretty rough death. It happens. We've had sheep growing up. Your livestock die, coyotes get them and stuff like that. And he goes, "This wasn't a coyote." And he's like, "I remember looking around, and when I was walking back, I kept seeing this thing in the shadows. And all of a sudden, as I got back to the house, like, he's like, dude, it looked like it had the top half of a goat and the bottom half of a dude." And I'm like, "Nah, Pa, you're not." But he'll tell you, like, he would, all the way up till he passed. He's like, "Dude, no, Dustin, I saw the goat man," you know? And it's like, to throw back at least some of those things, like could there possibly be a ape-like creature out there that we haven't discovered yet? Yeah, I think there probably could be somewhere. If there's We're finding animals, especially like deep in the Amazon, we're finding new insects all the time. So it's like, could there be an animal that we haven't found? Yeah, maybe so. Could You talk about how the deception has changed? Could demons, and Satan in some way have like grabbed a hold of this idea of some of these cryptids and been like, "Hey, I'm going to skew this and I'm going to change this and I'm going to make you chase this instead of chasing after Jesus." I think that could be as well. So it's like, what could it be? It could be a mixture of things. Do I really think at some point in day we're going to pull like, a skunk ape, I think's what they call them in like Arkansas and like Louisiana. Are we gonna like pull a big Sasquatch out of the woods? I don't know, maybe, but are there always going to be stories, and are some of those stories going to be like vaguely demonic, but maybe not totally demonic, to kind of give you that twinge of like naturalism? It
Right.
it kind of comes to the idea of what level of deception is it, and what game are the demons trying to play to get you to focus on. Now, I won't lie, I kind of do like Bigfoot though. Be kind of cool to see a big old Bigfoot guy. We actually went camping yesterday, and we're sitting around the fire, and we're with some friends of ours, and my son like just out of nowhere goes, "Hey Dad, I saw a Bigfoot over by the pond over there." I was like, "No, you didn't." And he goes, "Yeah, oh yeah, I did." And I'm like, "No, because I know you, and if you'd actually seen a Bigfoot, you'd have ran and be like, 'Dad, Dad, Dad, I saw one, I saw one, I saw one.'" And he goes, "Yeah, you're right."
That's awesome. All right. Well, look,
But I mean,
yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
no, so it's just interesting to kind of think through this stuff and look at these things and almost kind of see like what's the world around you? Because even the idea of, God has done so much to this world that we don't even know about yet. And I mean, there's probably so much even to discover and figure out from, the heavens all the way down to the deepest parts of the oceans. And it's like at some point, Satan is trying to maybe twinge our focus off of God onto mankind. And does that mean there's just not a Bigfoot? No. I mean, there might actually be a Bigfoot type creature somewhere, but does that mean Satan might mess with it? Yeah. And he may try to get you to think something different. I mean, it's interesting to ponder. These are the things that I like sit while I'm, drinking some coffee and just go, huh, I wonder, you know?
Yeah, now there's always definitely something good to have like a main topic where you're wondering about. And for me, like in doing this podcast, that's that type of the wondering, the curiosity, and the almost that drive to discover. Like I have that in general, but with the podcast, I like to try to do that, but kind of focusing like internally, like on you as an individual. What is it that you can uncover and discover about life to push you kind of further into that right direction and ultimately to God. But again, I think we could probably have so many more conversations, and I definitely
Oh
want to
yeah.
have again. I even have a few different thoughts of maybe how we could do that. But I love this conversation. Before we sign out, I try to ask as many guests as possible some of these questions. These are rapid-ish fire. They don't have to be like really quick one word and done, but but we're also not trying to make it a whole extra hour or two, unless you want to. But these are rapid-ish fire. So again, with this idea of charting life, you're going through and to uncharted locations. So there's been an island that's been discovered, and you are tasked with going and charting this previously unknown island. You could take 5 people with you, living or dead, real people, and the only couple of details is one person has to help you survive, and another person has to be a storyteller of some kind, and you can't pick Jesus.
I can't pick Jesus. Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
and
One person,
I just figure it's a little too easy, but
one person has to help me survive, and one person has to be a storyteller.
yeah. And then you got 3 others.
See, I originally when I first read that, like you sent me those questions, I was like, I'm gonna take my family. It's gonna be easy. But then I was like,
Yeah,
oh, but no one's really gonna help me survive. I'm kind of the survival guy. I was like,
and that's totally fine. Yeah.
And so I was like, I originally thought like, no, I'll just take my family and stuff like that. But at least for this, like for the survival guy, is I don't know if you've ever seen this show, but it's called Dual Survival. And in this show, there were two guys, and I can't remember his name, but one of the guys was like this hardcore like naturalist survival dude. Like they did a episode in the like winter, and he's just wearing wool socks. I mean, that guy was a man's man. And so I can't remember his name, but I'm taking that guy from the he's my survival guy because he'd be like, oh hey, I'm gonna make some fire and I found this rock and a piece of grass, and then the next thing you know it's like, oh hey, the fire's ready, and it's like, what? I like survival stuff. I actually teach a class for we homeschool our children. I teach a homeschool co-op class, like just kind of on basics of survival. But he would be like my survival guy. And as far as like a storyteller dude, I'd probably like do something weird and go all the way say like to William Shakespeare because I might could just listen to that guy talk and he'd provide a
Yeah.
ton of entertainment. You know what I mean? It's like you just talk over there, you make some fire, we're gonna hang out and have a good time. And then I guess the other three is I'd make my family draw straws to see which ones don't get to come.
Nice. Which that's awesome. So on your journey, you get to bring only one crop to plant that's either going to sustain you or help other endeavors out there. You only get one crop. What are you taking?
Okay, so I thought about this one. We do a garden every year, and about the only thing that I can grow, just stand on, like I can always grow it and I'll always have a decent crop is jalapenos. And so it's like I will take jalapenos because I can grow jalapenos. Now it's gonna be really hot, and all the jalapenos I grow are not mild at all. Like they're knock you down hot. But I'm like, if I'm surviving and I know I can grow it year in and year out, it's gonna be the jalapeno.
That works.
May not be the best choice in the world, but I know I can grow it. I know I'm not gonna have a bad crop.
There you go. I've had a few different answers for that. One I would probably do would be maybe something like corn, because assuming you can be successful with it, there's all sorts of things you can do with the plant itself, the stalk, the husk, all that sort of stuff. I've had people mention potatoes. which is also a good one if you're gonna subtly sneak in Lord of the Rings. You can boil them, mash
Yeah,
them.
boil them, mash them, stick them in a stew.
Yep.
See, I
uh,
would say it to potatoes, but man, I did potatoes like 3 years back, and
mhm.
they did not like. I planted like a whole bunch of potatoes, and I had like maybe 40, which seems like a lot, but when they're little new potatoes like that big, it's like, yeah, that's not gonna sustain me. But I know them jalapeno plants. I could eat those. I could eat that. I can grow those.
Yeah. The one it was interesting. My wife, she does okra the last couple of years, and okra. I don't know if this is how it's supposed to work or not, but there was one. I think she was just ready to give up on it, and it went from this plant to this. I just kind of playfully call it a tree because it sprouted. It was huge. I had so many things
Oh
comes
yeah.
out.
Oh
Hey,
yeah.
okra is that's a good plant. Yeah,
We always do okra, and it's by the end of the growing season, it's well over like my height. I mean, it's
and
always this
we're
massive, huge plant.
and we're about to we try to swear off of it by the end of the season every time. Okay, we have too much okra. Never again. 8 months later, here we go. Let's do this
Like
again.
it's okra time.
All right. So if you were trying to spend the next year of your life focusing on one area of improvement, what would that be?
Uh, in all honesty, probably if I had to really pick one, it'd be I'd say physical health and eating better. And all it's just because it's like me and my wife have kind of been having not really like health issues, but it's just like there's been some stuff happen that's like health issues in the family, and it's like, man, if I don't focus on that, then you know, it might happen in the future. So in all honesty, like you ask that question and it's like, cause like deep down, like for the next year, I'm trying to focus on it anyway. So it's like not necessarily like I'm gonna work out every day for 45 minutes, but more like, nah, try to work out a little bit, try to eat a little better, not going back for seconds. I really kind of like my seconds sometimes, and it's like, just trying to focus on more of the physical health and stuff like that. That would be my answer to that one.
Yeah. And this next question is I've had a hard time trying to really articulate it the best I can, but maybe I can say it this way. We both talked about in the beginning, there's things like ministry. You're not really exactly sure what it's going to look like, but you're just kind of going with whatever opportunity comes in front of you. But how do you try to decide which opportunities in life are worth pursuing and which ones are worth, holding off on?
See, I mean, you're right. That's
Math that you do to try
that's
is there pros and cons, or is there what's your mental math look like for that?
so my wife is a very big like list maker, and that helps her. And but for me, it's in a lot of ways just kind of like praying over it and kind of seeking the Holy Spirit's guidance. And okay, so where am I going here? What am I doing? And almost the idea of, especially on like really big things, like if you feel kind of a maybe or a don't, pursue it till God closes the door in some ways and shape and form. Because, like you said earlier, that I've got this kind of a small little farm. And so the way this actually came about is during COVID, a church closed down. And the church that closed down had some acreage. And so, like last year, like I'm at one of my camps and someone's like, hey, they're selling that church, down the road. And I'm like, oh, that's cool. And I was like, oh man, that'd be neat. Maybe I should see if we could like buy this. And it's like, okay, God, if this is something you want me to do, then help me pursue this. And it was like thing after thing after thing after thing after thing kept opening up and opening up and opening up. And now I'm living in a church, which is weird in its own right.
Yeah,
But hey, you know, and it's like, it's the idea of at some point, God will make it clear, like, hey, you don't pursue this, and it's like I've never prayed and felt God just go, yes. It's like, but I
right.
have prayed before and felt, no, not this one. And it's like through kind of
No,
pursuing him, I've okay, maybe I don't need to do that one. Maybe I need to do this, you know, and and I would just say, I mean, it's prayer. I mean, for me, it's prayer, trying to just discern God's will, which gets into kind of discernment, which is fun in itself because do I always get it right? No. Sometimes halfway through, I'm like, I didn't get that one right, but it's just leaning on Him for direction,
yeah,
you know?
yeah, and I do like what you mentioned there that you said that you don't always get it right. One of the biggest lessons my mom taught me growing up was she referenced David in the Bible was that one of the big things about him is anytime that he realized he did wrong before God, he repented as quickly as
Yeah.
as it made sense to him. And so that always get back up. Don't just wallow in it, and just get back up, keep moving on, and keep seeking back, going back to God with that. When was the last time you laughed so hard that it hurt?
Okay. See, this is gonna be bad, but it was like probably yesterday while we were camping. But do I have to tell the story? I mean, I'll,
It's up to
we're,
you.
the kids are playing flashlight tag, right? You know, they're still running around. And I mean, one of our friends have some acreage and they had just gotten the acreage. And so they don't have a house on it yet. They've just built some fences. They've got power. But I mean, we're in tents and we're just hanging out and all that kind of fun stuff. And my kids are running around and my kids are chasing their kids, which their kids are like, you know, a whole lot smaller. And like, we were sitting here talking, having a really hardcore conversation, and one of their little kids just like runs into the fire and he's like, I've got to go to the bathroom real bad. And then he goes, yeah, and then ran off. And I mean, it's like, I mean, we all just kind of died. I won't lie. But it was like just this little moment of like, and I mean, we weren't talking about anything terribly hardcore, but I mean, just conversation. And like, he just runs up and like the look on his face, like in the fire, was just like, ah.
That's awesome. Oh
Oh,
man,
it's
that
not like this hardcore, like epic joke. No, it's just a little kid being a little kid that made me laugh.
kids being kids can certainly do that. And who knows, maybe this next one is part of that too. I don't know. But what was the last thing that moved you to tears? I know kids can
Moved
do
me
that.
to, I will say probably the last time that like kind of moved me to tears is kind of coming back to the whole like us moving here is just seeing God's blessing. I mean, in all honesty, me and my wife were just sitting kind of watching the sunset and trying to think of like, the sun's dipping down behind that tree over there. And it's like that's a tree that God has given us, and almost the idea of I remember just talking about it and just kind of tearing up with the idea of God's kind of blessed us. And not I mean it's not like financially. It's not, new cars, but it's like, okay, God, you've given us this. How can I use this for you? And I'll say that may be like maybe a cop out answer, but it's like no, I mean in all honesty, it was just seeing God's blessing just kind of individually on the family and just kind of feeling moved by that. And, with the sunset of his blessing himself, him blessing the earth with just this beautiful sunset. And it's like, man, God, you're so awesome. You're so big. And I'm just this little guy trying to follow you. It's kind of almost the thought process, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. I know for me, I don't typically have a very wide range of emotions in my day to day life. It's I mean I may feel them, but I don't. It just doesn't. I don't express them out that much. But for any lack of crying I ever do, when it comes to God, I more than make up for it.
Yeah.
There's the tears just flow whenever, especially if I'm thinking about God's goodness, or we're at church, in worship. Sometimes I'm just like just overwhelmed by God, and I'm like, yeah, here comes the tears. But all right, last couple of questions. In your opinion, or in your understanding, what does it mean to be good?
Oh, that's a fun one. That's a really fun one. I mean, really, kind of on what does it mean to be good is trying trying just to focus on God and what he has for you. Because goodness may look different in different people. And not like one person can commit a crime but the other one can't. No, not like that. But it's like goodness for this person may be, giving some money and helping this person over here. But goodness for this person who doesn't maybe have the finances is baking that loaf of bread and helping their neighbor. It's like to be good, it's to maybe look for the needs around you and kind of seek God and how to fulfill them. I mean, because we live in a very financial culture. I mean, we do. I mean, it's money's everywhere. It's buying this and advertising wants your money. But it's like if you can bake bread, then you can help somebody who's hungry. If you can, sew, then you can clothe somebody who needs it. If you've got water, then you can give somebody a drink who's thirsty. And it's like it's maybe just kind of seeking those ideas. Okay, God, is there somebody immediately around me, whether in my neighborhood, in my house, or that needs this, and how can I fulfill that need in their life? So I guess that one answers that question.
Yeah,
Maybe.
that's
Yeah.
I think it's the first I've had an answer that answered in that particular degree. So I think that's a really good way to go about that. And lastly, let's assume for a sad moment that on your expedition things go sadly or go sideways, and you're only give. I know you're taking some of your family with you, but you can only send out one final message to your family. You've got maybe you're writing it down. You've got maybe a paragraph. After you get past the "I love yous," what's just the last bit of advice you could give to your family if this was going to be your last bit of advice?
Really, I mean, the last bit of advice I would give my family, mainly my kids, because I'm pretty sure my wife would draw straws and she would be dying with me.
Yeah.
As the boat's going down, the whole classic like Titanic moment, right? But probably my last advice, especially for my kids, would be never stop looking for God. You know, it's I know I try to tell my kids all the time, it's like, you see that tree over there? You know, God's in that tree. You know, you see that dirt right there? How long do you think it took that rock to grind its way down to that dirt? God did that. You know, and it's like, man, you see what man did. You see this road that went through here. Man, that looks like a nice road, right? It's a big road. But it's like, look at what God did all the way around this road. And it's like, never, I would say, like, never stop just looking for God in the little and mundane things. You know, whether it's, just like sitting here talking to you and just, talking and seeing how it's awesome. In all honesty, it's awesome like hearing your takes and stuff on stuff. And it's like seeing how you're focusing on God as well. It's like never stop just looking in the little bit for what God is doing and his blessings that may just be the blessing of, getting to see a friend today or however that looks, but just never stop looking for God in life in general. All right, man, I got real philosophical on that one.
Hey, that's all right. I mean, for this show, I like to have all the fun things, the spiritual stuff, and branching into philosophy and travel. I mean, this is all part of life. We're multifaceted individuals,
Yeah.
and but yeah, I do kind of like that, and it kind of helps. It kind of the easier said than done, but the kind of like final. If we ever think about the final advice we would give to family, that also should hopefully kind of inspire us to make sure that we live in that manner
Yeah.
too, and express that through our examples as well. So, but I definitely appreciate you, Dustin, having the conversation, coming on here, and this has been. I hate to end the conversation again. We definitely want to
Oh, it's
maybe
been fun.
really want to do this
Mhm.
again. But before we head off here, why don't you go ahead and tell people, where they can find you, listen to your podcast, or any way of reaching out to you, so they can get connected to you.
So we've got a podcast, me and a buddy of mine, Caleb. We call ourselves the Redneck Theologians because that's really what we are. I mean, we're just a couple rednecks who currently it's not hunting season, and so now we're just fishing because that's what you do in the spring. And
Mhm.
so, but we're the Redneck Theologians, and we do a podcast called Raising the Wild Ones podcast, which is really interesting. It actually kind of started off, we're like, hey, we're going to do parenting advice, and then we started talking about, weird kind of niche things in the Bible, and then that's kind of what it's turned into. And so you could go check us out on Spotify, Apple Podcast, all the thing. Where if you could find a podcast, we're probably there. I don't know how that works because I just put it in on the program and it sends it out, And
Right.
so we're also on YouTube with Raising the Wild Ones podcast. I'm working on getting that one better. So not a ton of episodes on YouTube right now, but there's a few Facebook, Instagram, all of those fancy things. If you want to shoot me an email or whatever, it's raisingwildones@gmail.com. I should have that written down somewhere. Probably do. Raising the Wild Ones podcast at gmail.com. That's
Wow.
it. That's it right there. And so you shoot me an email there and I'd love to chat and kind of hear with you. We're trying some interesting things in the podcast. So we're starting a thing called hillbilly hermeneutics, which is kind of fun.
Yeah.
And so basically it's just breaking down scripture from like cultural context and then what it means to us today and looking at it from like just kind of a word, what does these words mean, stuff like that. So that's kind of what we got going on. I don't have any fancy books or anything. Maybe one day I'll write a book, maybe, I don't know, but so that's kind of where you could find me and track me down, look us up, tell us what you think, and we're just a couple of rednecks talking to some people, and sometimes the conversation can get a little weird. It's okay. It's fine. Doesn't mean we completely agree 100% with what everybody's being said. We're just
Right.
kind of trying to figure out some of the stuff. But That's where I'm at. It's Raising the Wild Ones podcast.
And I can say I've listened to a lot of your episodes. I think it is absolutely fantastic and give it my full on endorsement as well. And this comes to the part where it is very difficult for me. I'm trying to get over myself a little bit and my weirdness around marketing and advertising myself. But here we go. If you like this, if this blessed you in any way, basically with the podcast, I kind of consider it a win if you think differently about a subject, if you learn something new, or if it just made your day a little bit better. If any of those happened, go ahead and give it a like, thumbs up, comment. If you really hate it, do the down button twice. So kind of undo the
Down, down.
yeah. So go do the like, subscribe, comment, all that sort of stuff. And then make sure you go on to Dustin's podcast over there with Raising the Wild Ones and do the same as well. Thank you guys, and we'll see you next time.